Bienvenidos a Valor con B, un podcast de BESTINVER para que nos acompañes en nuestra pasión por la inversión. BESTINVER es la gestora independiente de fondos de inversión y pensiones con más de 30 años de experiencia, perteneciente al grupo Acciona.
Hola, para los que no me conozcáis, soy Marta Vila, especialista de producto en BESTINVER y voy a guiaros durante este podcast. En el capítulo de hoy vamos a ponernos un poco más internacionales. Como sabéis, tenemos un equipo de inversión de un enorme talento, multidisciplinar y multigeneracional. Os hemos presentado a muchos de los integrantes del mismo durante este podcast. Y hoy tenemos con nosotros a Colin Gibson, que nos va a explicar un caso de inversión, Harley Davidson. Colin es analista Sénior especializado en el sector industrial en BESTINVER. Cuenta con una experiencia de 26 años como analista financiero y ha liderado equipos de análisis del sector industrial, primero en UBS, Goldman Sachs y desde 1996 en adelante. Se unió en BESTINVER en 2016 y, como os decía, pues nos va a contar una tesis de inversión en inglés, aunque también se publicará el post en el blog del equipo de inversión sobre Harley en español. Para los que pues tengáis más flojillo el idioma o simplemente queráis profundizar en el tema, que lo sepáis también. Así que nada, empezamos. Colin, ¿cómo estás? ¿Qué tal?
How are you? Muy bien, gracias. Thanks very much. Thanks very much indeed. Yeah, from now on we're in English. This is a podcast about our investment in an American motorcycle manufacturer, Harley Davidson. But in our view, Harley Davidson is such a unique motorcycle manufacturer that to understand it properly, we have to start somewhere else. And that somewhere else, I'm going to suggest, is Tokyo in the early 1890s. 24-year-old Kintaro Hattori began making Seiko watches in Tokyo in the early 1890s, which means, actually, if you think about it, that Japan's premier watch brand is in fact 10 years older than Switzerland's premier watch brand, which is Rolex. Rolex didn't begin its operations in Geneva until 1905, and the Rolex brand itself wasn't introduced until 1908. Despite that, the bulk of the Seiko range retails for a few $100s, whereas Rolexes are ever more expensive. For example, the Rolex Submariner was a fairly affordable $150 in 1957, or about 2 weeks' wages in American terms. Today it costs north of $8,000, or more than 2 months' wages for the average American. So where did Rolex go right, and where did Seiko go wrong? Seiko has been the greatest innovator of the past 100 years in the watch industry. They revolutionized the market with the world's first quartz watch in 1969. Quartz watches are better on almost every objective measure than the mechanical watches they seek to replace. They're lighter, they're more reliable, they're more accurate, they're cheaper to make. But we should never underestimate the power of marketing, the power of nostalgia, and the power of dreams. Faced with a threat from quartz watches, Rolex executives pulled in the 1970s a move of, let's face it, marketing genius. They decided that if mechanical watches weren't needed anymore, then they are going to have to be wanted. And so began Rolex's transformation from an object of necessity into an object of desire. Rolex understood that mechanical watches had something which quartz watches just didn't have. Mechanical watches had heritage. And it turns out that people are willing to pay good money for heritage. You can find an analogous story in the Scottish whisky industry. Originally, all whisky was single malt whisky. That is to say, it was made in a single distillery, in a small still called a pot still, from malted barley, and it was aged in a barrel. One of those distilleries was Glenfiddich, whose distillery in Dufftown, Scotland, was founded in 1886. Now, single malt is an expensive and a difficult way to produce whisky, and sure enough, in the early years of the 20th century, single malts were supplanted by blended whiskies, which were cheaper to make since you could make them in larger continuous stills. They mixed expensive malted barley with other cheaper grains, and they typically weren't aged for as long. But blended whiskies, deliberately mixed in order to have a homogenized, inoffensive taste, faced competition from Irish and American competitors, and a race to the bottom of the cost curve began, and the whiskey suffered. Hence, the Scottish whisky industry was on its knees when a few distilleries, tired of being beaten up on price by the blenders, decided in the late 1960s and early 1970s that maybe consumers would be prepared to buy their single malt whiskey directly. And the very first of those was Glenfiddich in Dufftown. Those single malts had heritage. They were, after all, where it started. they had a story, they had some romance, and sure enough, just like with watches, it turned out that consumers are happy to pay up for a bit of heritage and a bit of romance. So, back to motorcycles. Harley Davidson was founded literally in a small shed in Milwaukee, in the state of Wisconsin, in the US, in 1903. And to understand it better, first I need you to listen to something. That is the extremely distinctive sound of the current generation of one of the most iconic motorcycle engines of all time, Harley's Milwaukee 8. The design of the exhaust system probably contributes something to the sound, but most fundamental of all is the architecture of the engine. It's what's called an undersquare design, which means that the cylinders are longer than they are wide. There are two cylinders. They're arranged in a V configuration at a 45-degree angle, and they share just one connection, or pin, to the crankshaft. Harley is pretty much the only motorcycle manufacturer in the world with an engine like this, and consequently, though there are other manufacturers of motorcycles with long heritages such as BMW, Ducati, Triumph, only a Harley Davidson sounds like this. Apart from the unique sound, the engine design has some other distinctive characteristics. It doesn't produce as much power as some other designs, but it does produce an unusually large amount of that power at low engine speed, which is to say that it has a lot of torque. That means it's not really suited to riding around racetracks at high speeds, but it's very well suited to cruising long distances like you get in the continental United States. If you were looking for a sound which embodies the concept of American exceptionalism, then this maybe would be it. Harley Davidson is a motorcycle manufacturer with a unique, authentic heritage product. It occupies the same branding territory as a Swiss watch manufacturer or a Scottish single malt distillery. And sure enough, like Rolex or Omega or Macallan or Glenfiddich, Harley's products are expensive. They range from about $10,000 to up to over $30,000. Compare Harley's average selling price of between $15,000 and $20,000 with the average selling price of the world's number one motorcycle manufacturer, which is Honda of Japan. In a normal year, Harley should ship, let's say, around 200,000 motorcycles for between $15,000 and $20,000 each. Honda ships 100 times that number, around 20 million units, but their average selling price is 90% lower, $1,500, not $15,000. That all sounds great, possibly too great, because the shares of companies with strong consumer brands, brands with real heritage and real pricing power, tend to be very highly valued. And yet, we've invested in Harley Davidson, so what was the value opportunity then that we saw? Harley Davidson stock underperformed the US market from mid-2014 onwards, underperformance that only came to an end when the former CEO stepped down in March 2020. In our view, the former CEO didn't create the problems at Harley, but he didn't do that much to solve them either. A lot of manufacturing businesses have a mantra, and that is, you can't have too much of a good thing. More products manufactured means more products sold, means more revenue, means more profit. But for heritage brands like Harley Davidson, brands operating in the borderlands of the worlds of luxury goods, the rules are a bit different. Like true luxury brands, heritage brands rely on exclusivity and desirability. They fall into the category of what's often referred to as Veblen goods, a nod to US economist Thorsten Veblen, who first theorized about them in his 1899 book, The Theory of the Leisure Class. Veblen goods don't quite obey the normal laws of supply and demand, which say that as the price of something goes up, we buy less of it. Because for Veblen goods, their attractiveness depends on the very fact that they're expensive and exclusive. So, if you're a manufacturer of Veblen goods, and in an effort to generate sales and profits growth, you increase production more and more and more, you risk, to borrow a term from Aesop's fables, killing the goose that lays the golden egg. In our view, that's what successive Harley management teams slowly did following the company's IPO in 1987. Harley's production expanded by a factor of 5, from 70,000 bikes at the start of the 1990s to over 350,000 by 2006, the all-time high. That's production growth of a little over 10% annually, each and every year. This strategy of permanent production growth is always tempting, but Harley shows the risks. As they ramped up production ever further, they started pinning their hopes more and more on customers in export markets to buy all of these bikes. But the truth is that Harley is a niche brand which appeals to Americans more than almost anybody else. And that's why Harley is the number one brand in the US market and has the larger dealer network, nearly 600 dealers. Harley's international expansion strategy was one long disappointment, which meant that they had to flood their home market with more and more bikes they had hoped to export, which meant that dealers had to sell them at ever greater discounts. During the peak Harley period, that 350,000 units I was just talking about, discounts of 10 or 20% were quite common. And that's on a product whose gross margin is maybe only 30%. In the end, even the discounts didn't help. Harley experienced falling sales volumes in its core US market in 9 of the 13 years between 2006, the peak year, and 2019. Over the period, the company's US retail sales actually halved from 268,000 motorcycles to 127,000. Once a heritage brand like Harley starts compromising this much on its price point and doesn't see any payback in the form of higher volumes, you know something's gone badly wrong. Harley is in fact a poster child for the dangers of what's known as quarterly capitalism, focusing too much on the short term and not enough on the long term. And the stock market knew it too. Harley's market capitalization fell from a peak of over $18 billion in 2006 to under $6 billion by the end of 2019. So now we've discussed what went wrong at Harley and why a value opportunity arose in what used to be, a highly valued company. That's great. But if our investors are going to see a return on their money, we need to understand not only the nature of the hole that Harley had dug for themselves, but also how they were going to dig themselves out of it. In these sorts of situations, new management is often helpful and sometimes essential. So, we were very excited in the first quarter of 2020 when we learned that Harley was getting a new CEO. And not just any CEO, but a member of consumer brand royalty, a man called Jochen Zeitz. Zeitz became famous in management circles, and quite wealthy into the bargain, for being the man who turned around sporting goods company Puma between 1993 and 2011. But it turns out he's also a lifelong motorcyclist and a Harley enthusiast. When Zeitz took over at Puma, the company was going through some long wilderness years, I have to say far worse than anything Harley's seen recently. Puma had seen its revenues halve since a late 1980s peak and hadn't actually made a profit for 15 years when Zeitz took over. Zeitz ignored the doubters and transformed Puma into a hipster brand, showing not only real grit but considerable vision. For example, he created a brand new category for the brand, Formula One footwear, which became a $1 billion business. During his tenure, the company became the world's number 3 sportswear brand and saw its market capitalization increase by 4,000%. So, what is Zeitz's recipe for a turnaround at Harley? I think there are 3 key ingredients. Number 1, move Harley from what's referred to as a push-based manufacturing model to a pull-based manufacturing model in order to get inventories under control and to raise prices. This means no longer deciding in the boardroom how many bikes to manufacture, but listening more to dealers' feedback about how many bikes the market can take and at what price points. Second, focus on the core product and the core customer first, but then expand the total addressable market by launching new products in adjacent market segments. And third, grow ancillary revenues by capitalizing on the lifestyle brand opportunity in apparel, which Zeitz sees as a $1 billion revenue opportunity for Harley in 10 years' time. And with his background, he should know after all. Bear in mind that apparel gross margins are probably more like 40% versus motorcycle gross margins more like 30%, so each dollar of apparel sales punches well above its weight on the bottom line. Already we can see the benefits of this approach. Firstly, inventories have fallen from 80,000 units to only 40,000 units. Zeitz didn't let a good crisis go to waste in 2020. Secondly, the average selling price of Harleys since Zeitz took over has already increased by some 7 percentage points. Thirdly, Harley has nearly doubled its total addressable market to between $9 and $10 billion from the around $5 billion previously by launching its first model in the adventure trail segment, the Pan America, a huge market segment that somehow Harley has overlooked for several decades. And lastly, Zeitz has taken Harley's lead in electric motorcycles and split out the existing e-bike, the Livewire model, as a standalone brand. E-bikes are brand new, so it's hard to know how this will really affect long-term growth, but clearly in the long run it will be a very big category, probably the dominant category in some markets, for example in Europe. We think that when all the elements in Zeitz's turnaround have been deployed and have had a little time to take effect, Harley could be, number 1, selling for an average price of between $17,000 and $18,000, 200,000 motorcycles a year, a long way below their 350,000 peak, reflecting our desire to build a margin of safety into our investment case. 2, generating ancillary revenues of between $1 billion and $1.5 billion from spare parts, components, apparel, and other life cycle products. Remember, we talked about life cycle products alone as a $1 billion opportunity for Harley in the long run. So again, we're trying to give ourselves a margin of safety. Thirdly, generating an operating margin of some 14% from the core manufacturing business, better than in recent years, but far below the 24% they recorded in the peak years. There's our margin of safety again. And finally, making a further $700 million of revenues from financing. Remember that throughout Harley's difficult recent years, the company's consistently profitable in-house finance company, Harley Davidson Financial Services, has been one of the few good news stories. If we're right about this, then Harley's manufacturing unit should, in a few years' time, be generating free cash flow of some $700 million annually. Taking that and adding in the value of the finance unit, we think Harley deserves a market capitalization of at least $9.5 billion, 60% higher than the current valuation. And here we're certainly not giving full credit to the opportunity in the lifestyle products business. Lifestyle, under certain assumptions, could for Harley be a business opportunity worth between $1 and $3 billion. There's our final margin of safety. At between $9 billion and $10 billion, Harley will be closer to having the heritage brand valuation we think it clearly deserves. And our investors will have made a great return on their money.
Okay, thank you very much, Colin. Muchas gracias a todos por escucharnos y nos vemos pronto.
Gracias a ti.
Gracias.
Hasta luego.
Gracias por escucharnos. Volveremos pronto con otro episodio de Valor con B, un podcast de BESTINVER. Hasta pronto.